Richard Milhous Nixon's presidency is remembered for being full of excitement, intrigue, grievously bad judgment, and tidal waves of booze. Oh, and of course there was Watergate, which ended in the resignation of a president, which probably remains the single most famous political scandal in American history. In its wake, it became clear to Richard Nixon that his removal was inevitable and that he would have to do the unthinkable, resign his office. Today, we're going to take a look at everything that happened in the days leading up to Nixon's resignation. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other U.S. presidential topics you would like to hear more about. Okay, my fellow Americans, this video is not a crook. Having previously served as the United States' 36th Vice President, Richard Nixon was voted into the highest office in the land in 1969. He was a Republican who had formerly been a representative and later senator from California. First elected to serve in the federal government in 1946, Nixon developed a staunch anti-communist reputation and only narrowly lost the 1960 presidential election to John F. Kennedy. During his presidency, Nixon ended the war in Vietnam, opened diplomatic relations with China, and established the Environmental Protection Agency. However, his presidency would come to be defined on June 17, 1972, when 5 men were caught breaking into the Democratic Party headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. A series of articles written for the Washington Post by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein linked the men to the president's re-election committee, and from there, the scandal grew. In 1973, Watergate Special Counsel Archibald subpoenaed the secret tapes Nixon made of his Oval Office meetings. And long story short, an 18-minute gap in the recordings came to light. Though it didn't prove anything, it made many suspicious that Nixon had personally known about the cover-up. In November of 1973, Nixon gave an interview on television in which he famously said, "People have got to know whether their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook." Despite his fighting spirit, however, his allies increasingly abandoned him, and the evidence against him mounted. Nixon was soon informed that the Senate, with a Democrat majority, had enough bipartisan support to achieve the necessary 2/3 majority vote to impeach. The writing was on the wall. He would have to resign, and he wasn't happy about it. Getting drunk and blasting a movie soundtrack is something your college roommate Tad might do on a Saturday night, but it was also one of Richard Nixon's pastimes. Nixon loved to get soused and listen to the score from Victory at Sea, a 26-part documentary about World War II naval combat that was made in the 1950s. Don't judge Nixon, or Tad, too harshly. Nixon was far from being alone in his love of this particular series soundtrack. The music, which had been recorded by the NBC Symphony Orchestra, was critically acclaimed, as was the entire run of the show it came from. If you're wondering what Nixon's second favorite thing to listen to was, take it from us, it's tough to dance to. Because when Nixon wasn't inebriated and listening to Victory at Sea, he was usually busy listening to tapes of himself. Tricky Dick was known to replay the tapes recorded in the Oval Office on endless repeat, especially the parts that were being used as evidence against him as his presidency was crumbling. The 25th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States provides that, in case of the removal of the President from office or of his death or resignation, the Vice President shall become President if the President is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. This amendment would automatically kick in if Nixon resigned, but some didn't want to wait for impeachment or resignation to unfold procedurally. Some claimed it was too dangerous to stand around waiting for Nixon to voluntarily resign, recklessly endanger the security of the United States, or be removed from office. Rumors about using the 25th Amendment to replace Nixon with Vice President Gerald Ford on the grounds that he was no longer fit for office began to circulate. The President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. military, which led some to imagine fanciful scenarios about him calling upon the nation's forces to maintain his position. Colorful rumors included a sympathetic U.S. Air Force, the Army's 82nd Airborne, or even the Marines staging a coup to keep the president in power. The Soviets, the great Cold War foe of the United States, were even cast in these imagined plots as a nefarious force maneuvering both politically and militarily to keep Nixon in the White House, for some reason. These fever dreams were ignored by most. And rather than calling up the military, Nixon hid out in his office at the executive building across the street from the White House, or in the Oval Office, drinking and brooding over where it all went wrong. A few in power were more than just worried about Nixon's behavior. One such was Defense Secretary James Schlesinger, who felt he had to step in, and not as a shoulder to cry on. He reached out to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and ordered that before they did anything President Nixon ordered them to do, they had to bring it to him first. Schlesinger also took it upon himself to instruct the military not to follow any orders for a nuclear strike that Nixon may issue. But that wasn't enough. Schlesinger was so concerned with an erratic Nixon that he had various contingency plans drawn up for what to do in case the president would not leave the White House willingly. We have to assume it involved more than just the phrase, "pretty please." These actions were necessary to save the nation, at least according to Schlesinger. There is no documentation of any such orders or plans, and no public officials have ever corroborated the stories. Schlesinger's patriotic efforts to protect the democratic integrity of his country, whether real or self-promoting myth, were never necessary. The transition of power went smoothly. As for Schlesinger, Gerald Ford fired him for insubordination in 1975. He was later appointed as the first Secretary of Energy by Jimmy Carter, who also fired him a couple years later in 1979. His bosses may have found him difficult for the same reason. As journalist Paul Glastris notes, Schlesinger was unbearably arrogant and impatient with lesser minds who disagreed with him. In his final days in the White House, Richard Nixon slept very little and drank a whole lot. There were even accounts of him walking up and down the White House halls at all hours, talking to portraits of former presidents and giving speeches to the pictures on the wall. And to be clear, these weren't magic talking portraits. Those were just at Hogwarts. Given this sort of behavior, Nixon's staff became concerned that he would hurt himself, or worse. The president reportedly talked often about how military officers fall on their swords, as they say, to take their own lives and avoid humiliation. He's once even alleged to have said that he bitterly regretted not owning a pistol that could do the job. After that, his advisors decided to take away his sleeping pills, just in case. Richard Nixon told his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, that he would be leaving office in early August of 1974. One of the White House staff was able to listen in on the call and has reported that Nixon was clearly drunk, slurring his words and out of control. Only a few days before that call took place, the two men had had dinner together. After eating, Nixon reportedly asked Kissinger what his legacy would be. Kissinger tried to reassure the president he would be given credit for his accomplishments. Nixon is alleged to have broken down in tears, fell to his knees, and asked Kissinger to pray with him. So the two men prayed together. Then Kissinger patted Nixon on the back, hugged him, and helped him to his feet. After that, they had another drink, which is understandable. On August 8, 1974, Richard Nixon announced his resignation to the people of the United States. However, shortly before he made a speech, he met with members of Congress. Reports say that Nixon broke down in tears before them, and as he prepared to deliver his statement to the nation, he continued to cry. The makeup artists are said to have had to work around Nixon's tears as they tried to make him presentable for a television audience. They must have done an all right job. The address was well received by most members of the media, despite the fact that Nixon didn't admit to any wrongdoing. Richard Nixon may have been in deep denial about his situation, but his wife Pat knew what was coming. While her husband met with politicians and readied his speeches, Pat very pragmatically began to pack up the White House. Starting 2 days before her husband made his public announcement, Pat Nixon was working to get the family's possessions into boxes for the move. Aides report she spent many sleepless days and nights on the project. So, if you were President of the United States, what would you do on your last night in the White House? Well, if you're like Richard Nixon, you'd stay up making phone calls till 2 a.m. After that, he made his way down to the White House kitchen at around what he thought was 4 a.m., but was actually 6 a.m., because the president's watch had stopped. As he said, the battery had run out, worn out, at 4 o'clock the last day I was in office. By that day, I was worn out too. Since it was morning, Nixon decided to hang around and chat with the White House kitchen staff. Then he ordered one last breakfast at taxpayer expense. It was a large meal of eggs and hash. This is technically the last full meal he had in the White House, although he did subsequently order one last snack before he left: pineapple, cottage cheese, and a glass of milk. Ugh, I'll pass. Though he didn't believe he had done anything wrong, Nixon was eventually convinced to accept a pardon from Gerald Ford. This pardon was issued on September 8, 1974. Nixon then gave a statement admitting he was wrong in not acting more decisively and more forthrightly in dealing with Watergate. In the end, he never admitted to any criminal acts. Retirement didn't suit Richard M. Nixon. According to biographers, after Nixon returned home to San Clemente, California, he was a soul in torment. Despite the fact he had no job, he still showed up at his desk every morning at 7 a.m. So what do you think? What are your impressions of Nixon's legacy? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.